This is Chapter 2, Sociology 354. So, if we don't learn the idea of the gender binary, by observing the people around us, where is this idea coming from? So one of the main questions the chapter is really looking at is how do we learn this binary? And how does it become part of the hidden curriculum of our lives? Meaning, it's something that's taught and reinforced in so many aspects of our lives. So if you've taken introductory sociology, you know that we have agents of socialization. So these are people, institutions in our lives that have a great deal of influence on how we behave, our development of our ideas and values, and really our identity. So think about some of the agents of socialization in your own life, right? Such as your parents, your schooling, the media, etc. And think for a second, how have these forces, these agents of socialization, how have they shaped your expectations and understandings of gender? Right? Again, this is what it means to be part of the hidden curriculum. It's something that's happening all the time. So, because of our socialization, because of these messages we receive about gender, we tend to use the term opposite sex when describing the relationship between men and women. So why don't we say the other sex or a different sex? Why do we say opposite? So language is really important. It's something that we have to be critical about and understand that language affects meanings. And oftentimes the language can either, obviously it's there to explain, but often it constrains our meanings by giving narrow definitions that then shape the way that we understand things, right? So when it comes to the dynamics between men and women, we see these things as opposites, right? It becomes a case of us versus them in a number of subtle and very obvious ways as well. So this comes from ideas in the culture from the past as well as the reinforcement of these ideas today. So when you look at personhood or this idea of inferiority and superiority, 17th century Europeans and early Americans believed in this idea of superior and inferior versions of personhood, right? This is something that came along with colonization. So in this ideology in regards to gender, women were considered inferior. They were considered to have an inside-out penis, right? As this creepy illustration figure 2.1. It was too good to pass up. You got to put that on the slide there. So this was this kind of social understanding that affected even the medical understanding at the time, right? So we see how cultural meanings have impacts on all sorts of institutions, and likewise, those institutions have impacts on forces like gender. So opposite is clearly, it's not accurate, right? Opposite suggests that if one sex is something, the other is not, right? And it forces a binary, which is not true. Male and female anatomy do have a lot of similarities and do develop from the same fetal tissue. So all of our bodies are all human. We're all developing from the same blob of tissue that's modified to enable that sexual reproduction. So while it's not accurate to say that there's only one sex, neither is it correct to say that men and women are opposites. So when it comes to the gender binary, there are so many more similarities than differences. And this is, again, still talking in a kind of heteronormative and also dualistic ideology that somehow there's only two representations of gender, right? So when it comes to analyzing that, even from their own perspective, this idea of two opposites, right? Men and women actually have much more similarities than differences, right? That there are strengths and weaknesses from each construction of masculinity or femininity. So the gender binary argument just argues that there's only two types of people: male-bodied people who are masculine and female-bodied people who are feminine. So because we tend to think in terms of binaries, we routinely group men together as if they're all alike, or women together as if they're all alike. And often they call this monoliths, right? So, it's kind of generalizing a lot of groups. And again, as we talk more about the importance of intersectionality, we have to acknowledge that not every man who's a male-bodied person experiences gender masculinity the same way, just as not every woman experiences those things the same way, because we have intersecting identities that affect these constructions and the way we are treated and how we then experience life, right? So there's a lot of things wrong with this gender binary argument, right? When you think of it, how many of you do not neatly fit into a gender binary, right? Even those of us who present as cisgender often find the definitions of gender to be very constraining, right? That we often hit the boundaries or the barriers of the expectations of the performances of gender, even within cisgendered performances, because there's little lines, right, where if you cross that line, you're violating that gender norm. So there's also, it's an interesting concept, the personal exception theory. This is a tendency to categorize people based on the binary, which of course results in stereotyping, but a large number of us believe that we are somehow the only exception, right? That, we're an exception, everyone else, they're the stereotype. So, but when we really stop to think about it, we could think about a lot of the people in our lives, right? Maybe our family, our friends, our coworkers, right? Classmates, other people that we come in contact with in our daily life. Do they neatly fit these stereotypes? Often not. And then, of course, we'll talk about this later in the class, when you really delve into those who actually do perform that kind of, expected roles, do they actually feel internally that that represents who they are? Or do they feel socially or maybe in other forms coerced into performing that particular role, right? So we'll talk all about that. So, we all think that we're the exception, but really the personal exception could also be for everyone else. So when we really start to think about this, we have to think about the ways that we don't fit the binaries. So what does this mean for ourselves? What does this mean for the concept of the gender binary? The more that we examine it, the more that we realize it's not valid or some sort of scientific fact. It's just a belief system that governs how gender should be organized within a particular society, right? So we'll talk about how those things historically have evolved, how they continue to change today, and the importance of kind of really understanding that these things are socially motivated values. These are often motivated through external forces than ourselves, right? But also the way that we perform, the agency that we have, also has the power to push back on these binaries. And so briefly coming back to that question, what does this mean for the gender binary? It just means that if the gender binary is a construction that doesn't even accurately represent cisgendered people, let alone those people who are on the margins or transgress or are challenging the expectations of gender, then maybe the whole binary is wrong. All right, moving to gender socialization. So it seems natural to us, right? But gender is socially constructed for us. It's something that, again, as we'll discuss throughout the class, when we talk about different specific institutions, different social roles we take on throughout our lives, that it's so ingrained into us that we consider it often just kind of a natural phenomenon or something that we're unconsciously performing. So gender is a logic that we manipulate, but it also manipulates us, right? We have agency. Once we open our eyes and see the way that these things have been constructed for us, we then have choices in how we express ourselves. So we can push back on the expressions of gender in our own ways. Yet what we think is appropriate or how we even experience our own bodies has always been shaped our whole lives through the systems of gender within our culture. So our socialization makes us so skilled at layering ideas about gender onto the world that we have a hard time seeing them for what they really are. So we don't always notice when gender stereotypes fail to make sense because there's so much other ideology that we've told ourselves makes sense that we don't see the obvious glaring problems until we start to think about it in relation to ourselves often, like that personal exemption theory. That, oh no, it totally works, it makes sense as a binary, it's just I don't fit that, but everyone else does. The idea is like, no, people don't fit that. And so once you start to break that down, you can see beyond the construction And a lot more of these things become much more obvious, right? So just really provides us with a social framework that we can understand the world through. But of course, this is a very limited worldview and something that has a lot of negative consequences in the way that it constricts people's opportunities. So then, looking at the binary of our bodies, and something we'll talk much more about in chapter 3, we categorize based on bodies, right? So since we realize that there are more than our bodies, our tendency to categorize on bodies is flawed. So if we're just saying gender has to do with how you were biologically born, then that's obviously a flawed system, because even in that, there isn't a binary for sex. This is the one that gets people riled up. So we assume this sex binary, right? XY, XX, because that's what we were taught. But we often ignore the intersexed, the reality of the intersexed experience. And really, being born intersexed is more common than having Down syndrome or cerebral palsy, but we've heard about Down syndrome. We've seen people with cerebral palsy. So we just don't see represented the intersex community often, and we'll talk about later, because of forced surgeries on babies. But anyway, that's some fun stuff to look forward to in chapter 3. So at this point, we're just really talking about how the way that we categorize, if we're basing it on bodies, that doesn't make sense, right? And so there's different variations of people's bodies that affect a kind of dualistic or binary construction. So people with androgen insensitivity, for example, are born with genitalia that may not fit definitions of female or male. And also, in general, intersexed individuals, they are living proof that not everyone fits into a sex binary, right? And so if we're basing a gender binary on the illusion of a sex binary, no wonder gender doesn't make sense. So people who are intersex remind us that while we take for granted everyone is clearly male or female, the path to a straightforward body often involves many complicated steps. So we'll talk about the kind of social construction of these things throughout the course. So when it comes to gender identity and gender expression, gender identity is involving oftentimes that binary definition of becoming a man or becoming a woman within the United States today. And of course, this is more than just physical development. This has so much more to do with the performance. So our gender identities are about who we feel we are in the world, and how we identify may not be consistent with societal expectations for our gender. So most people assume that one's body, one's gender identity, and their gender expressions will all line up. But they often don't. And that's fine. It's not a problem, but it's a social problem, right? Because if we base our understandings on a binary that doesn't truly exist, then we have to force that binary to reinforce those divisions. And that often leaves a lot of people in the crosshairs who don't feel that that represents them at all. So when it comes to gender expression, most of us learn to communicate our gender identity through our appearance, through our dress, and through our behavior, which is our gender expression. So our bodies, gender identity, and gender expression do not always match. So it's estimated that 1 out of every 100 people is intersexed, and more than 1 in 10 report feeling, as masculine as they do feminine, or more gender atypical than typical. So this personal exemption, there's a lot of people feeling that. So the idea is that, as much as we assume a lot of these things based on how we've been socialized, there's a much more complicated system underlying gender. Okay, so the 10%. So we all know intersex people. We probably just don't know that they're intersex. Some intersex people themselves might not even know until a health condition emerges. And that's why it can be such a complicated subject for people. So some conditions are chromosomal, and others are anomalies or hormone related as to creating an intersexed body. So there's concerns about the consequences of violating a gender binary. This has forced parents often to have these conversations with doctors, where doctors convince parents that it's best for their child to choose genital surgeries for infants to quote-unquote fit inside of the binary. So having a child that doesn't fit in concerns a lot of parents. However, intersex activists argue that doctors should delay surgery until children are old enough to decide for themselves if they want genital surgeries. So the practice of choosing genital surgery for intersex infants continues because of our discomfort with bodies that we see as deviating from something we consider normal. So there's this article I make students read in my sexualities class, and it kills me. There's this quote from a doctor who performs these kind of genital surgeries on infants, and I can't get out of my head because it's so brutal. But the quote was, "It's easier to change the child than society." So you have all of these babies, and then oftentimes these are surgeries that go on for years and years at a time. You know, a couple years later, another surgery, a few years later, another surgery. And the article I have them read talks about people's experiences with their own bodies when they're going through those kind of surgeries. Like growing up as a young person, not knowing because no one's telling you what's going on with your body, but knowing that something is wrong, right? So this notion of changing the child instead of changing society is awful, right? But as long as these practices become routine and keep happening, that binary is then reinforced, right, through fitting infants to that binary. So we can think about this. Obviously, there's consequences that parents think that they are helping their child with, right? Meaning having genitals that don't look like other children's, or maybe the consequences they fear for later in life, like maybe reproductive capabilities, things like that. But in reality, oftentimes, think about the first thing that people ask when they know someone's pregnant or when a baby is born. What is the first thing they ask? Is it a boy or a girl? Right? This false binary, this idea that there's no intersexed individuals, it's one or the other. So it can be very complicated for parents to navigate that, especially when they're not really informed about these issues. And these things often can be, we believe in the authority of doctors. And if they're telling you that you need to get this done for the safety of your child, a lot of people are going to go through with that. So we'll talk more about this when we talk about Chapter 3. Okay, another group of people whose gender identity does not conform to the gender binary are called transgender. So some trans people experience a form of gender dysphoria, which is a discomfort with the relationship between their body's assigned sex and their identity. While, even definitions and understandings of trans people, it's the same thing. There are no monoliths. We can't say, well, this is what every trans person experiences, because there's always going to be different experiences based on our intersecting identities, right? And really just variety within the similar identities. So some trans people identify as men or women, while others identify as trans men or trans women, and others identify as non-binary, meaning they're outside or between the male-female binary, which can also be described as genderqueer, right? So some trans people choose to change their bodies with either, surgical or hormonal treatments, while others do not. And there's a variety of reasons for this, and we'll discuss this later on. So if you think about examples from the book about increasing acceptance of non-binary gender identities, you can see why these understandings of bodies will change over time. And there is kind of a historical legacy of people feeling that they had to change their bodies, oftentimes just to even get identification or to be acknowledged by the state. So these are things we'll discuss more in depth later. Just to jump in a little bit too with pronouns and identity choices. So some trans, genderqueer, or gender fluid and non-binary people prefer alternate pronouns, right? So some prefer pronouns he, him. Some prefer she, her, while others prefer gender-neutral pronouns, such as the singular they, them, or different variations like sie, zer. So sometimes people change their gender identity as they evolve, or they are more gender fluid, which means they don't have a fixed gender identity in the same way that other people do. So when we understand the kind of more nuanced understandings of gender, we see that it's much more interesting and complex than the kind of binary that we're being told and reinforce throughout our lives is the norm or is the standard that should be adhered to, right? When in reality, there's been such variety in expression, in experience of gender, and that's something that makes it much more interesting and exciting. Okay, so the 90%. The term cisgender is used to refer to male and female-bodied people who comfortably identify or express themselves as men and women. So the idea of oppositeness in males and females, this helps police those boundaries of femininity and masculinity by emphasizing the differences. So if you think for a moment, you could probably share some examples of people policing either yourself or other individuals you've seen whose behavior violates gender norms, and how this policing takes place, where it takes place. These things affect our own then internalized sense of gender and our socialization. So even when we look at physical characteristics, there is a clear gender difference in some ways, obviously, but there's still a lot of overlap in male and female bodies. So this means that male and female physical traits such as height, hairiness, shape, strength, agility, flexibility, and bone structure overlap much more than they differ, right? We like to create this idea that all men are big, strapping, covered in hair kind of thing, and women are somehow tiny, hairless creatures. But in reality, we know that some men are small. Some women are big, right? There's a lot more variety within than between. So a lot of people feel that they don't match up with these expectations because the expectations themselves are very constraining and very narrow in definition. And we'll explain why and talk all about the history of that fun stuff. So when we think about it, oftentimes cisgender people create difference, right? So what does that mean? It just means they're changing their bodies, their styles of dress, how they move, right? So that they can emphasize femininity or masculinity, right? When you think about what does it mean to perform masculinity, right? What does that mean in how you walk, how you talk, how you dress, how you act, how you deal with conflict, right? Things like that versus femininity. Think about all of the body care maintenance rituals that women are expected to perform that men don't, right? As in most men that are performing a masculinized gender identity are not going to be going to the salon to get, a blowout and nails and lashes and, waxing and all of these kind of things that are much more normative to a femininity's performance expectations, right? So we're creating the difference. Meaning if women maybe, or let's say like if everyone wore makeup, how much different would that make these kind of understandings or expectations of faces if no one wore makeup, right? Or again, obviously people should be able to decide if they want to wear makeup or not. It's just this idea that we often are creating the differences in the hairstyle choices we make, the clothing choices we make, the kinds of cars we drive. I mean, California, that's a big thing, right? What kind of car you drive. So, these little things add up. Even the kind of food that we eat, right? There's a lot of weird assumptions in the culture about masculinity and like red meat, and like women and like eating salads. I don't know. We'll talk about a lot of these things, and I want to hear from you to hear about some of your examples that you've experienced of just random stuff that gets gendered, but all of those things are just reminders in your life that there's kind of an invisible boundary around you and that you're trying to perform within a very narrow box or confined space, right? So moving on to gender ideology. So ideology is just a set of ideas or widely shared beliefs by members of a society. And these ideologies guide our identity, our behavior, and then, of course, the institutions that we're a part of. So gender ideology is widely shared beliefs about how men and women are, how they should be, how they do and should behave. And again, from a sociological point of view, we're not talking about should be, shouldn't be in a matter of moralistic or value or any of that crap. It's more about we're trying to understand the social organization, and a lot of these narratives have a very should narrative to it, but of course that's not what sociologists believe. So anyway, think about this for a moment. What are some of the reasons why we want to embrace societal ideologies? Right? Why is it that we have these shared beliefs? Well, there's oftentimes a cohesion to society that comes from having shared expectations, right? There's, or at least functionalists would argue that there's a lot of benefits to these things, right? But then again, think about this. What are some of the dangers in a shared belief system, right? Those that are on the margins are very vulnerable in this kind of ideology, right? So the gender binary is just one way to think about gender. There are many ways to think about gender. And other cultures have different understandings of gender, which is why we know it's not universal. Because if gender was something that was normative and natural, it would have been the same throughout history, which we already know it has not been. It's changed dramatically even just in the last 100 years, right? And it's something that we can see differences in between cultures. So cultural variations have an impact on gender identity or gender expression within different cultures and the expectations of gender within their confines of their culture. So we know that these things are socially constructed, or they would just exist across time and across space, but they don't. So when it comes to other cultures, a lot of other societies or cultures believe that there are more than just two genders, or reject this binary ideology that we promoted in American society. So they see gender as more fluid, some cultures, right? So for example, the book points out that the Navajo have a fifth gender fluid category for a person whose gender is constantly changing. So they even understand the concept of gender fluidity within the cultural definitions of gender, right? Something that, predates by so much this colonial understanding that was imposed upon, this land. So we're going to discuss some other examples as well from other cultures, much more in depth in future lectures, but just, and the book does a good job of giving some of these examples. And really, it's not about memorizing each cultural variation. It's more just to show and demonstrate that there are variations and that our system isn't right or wrong. It's just our system, and it can be changed. And as a lot of people would argue, it should be changed. So when it comes to sex switching and differing definitions of gender, different cultures, again, have different ways of seeing things. Culture conceptualizes and defines categories of sex and gender differently, along with the role that non-binary people play within the culture. So some cultures have very strict rules that lead to an acceptance of permanent sex switching. So sex switching occurs when people who are assigned, biological females at birth become social boys. Right, so the example from the textbook discusses cultural ideals in Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, where biological girls and women are not allowed to leave their home without a male family escort, sex-switched children are accepted. So the child, called a basha posh, leaves the home as a male to attend to the family business, right, like grocery shopping and other things that female family members are not allowed to do. But when the child reaches puberty, she becomes female again, and a younger sister may take over that responsibility. So sex switching is not unique to Afghanistan. It's been found in various cultures throughout history, but it's just one example to kind of give shape to the ways in which these ideologies and the cultural values shape what potentials or what, kind of accepted expressions there are within a culture. So through sex switching, they were allowing this fluidity and change both functionally within society and personally within the individual. And then when it comes to genitals and gender, so again, genitals do not determine gender. Our sexed bodies are real, but gender ideologies vary, which leads us to interpret our bodies and our feelings about them differently according to social contexts. So we impose the binary on things other than our bodies as well. Just think of how we do gender to all sorts of things in our world, right? Like we gender objects, animals, styles of clothing or hairstyles, so on. Okay, so the binary and everything else. So gender is a social construction. It's not natural, right? It doesn't exist outside of the cultural context. So as we apply rules to ourselves and others in support of the gender binary, we're also applying gender labels to those other things we were just talking about, like objects or activities, even ideas can be gendered. So sociologists use gender as a verb when talking about the process by which something becomes coded as masculine or feminine. So gendering is associating things with a gender. We'll lump together things as masculine or feminine, and oftentimes these things are not necessarily connected, but we just kind of reinforce them over time until they become normal to us culturally. So the gender binary also causes us to falsely disconnect masculine ideas from feminine ones, making it harder to form all these connections between them. So when you think, for example, how we gender something like strength or compassion, right? Those are good things, both of them. Having strength, having compassion. Why should one be relegated to a gender binary definition of masculinity and one to a gender binary definition of femininity? When in reality, those are good strengths for anyone to have, right? So this kind of comes back to our gender binary glasses. This is an interesting way of looking at it that the textbook kind of uses, right? So helping us see the world the way that most other people around us do. It preserves the binary for us. Like earlier in the chapter, they discussed how it's why we don't see all the glaring flaws with the way the gender is organized. So people who are trained to subscribe to the gender norms, they find comfort in people that have the same views as them. So our socially trained brains tell us what gender is, how it should be expressed, and we favor those that have that same brain training. So our gender binary glasses give us cultural competence, which is a familiarity or knowledge with how members of our society typically think and behave. There's some aspects of society and the relationships between the people in them that are prescribed by our gender binary and our gender binary glasses, which allow us to see the world through a shared social lens, which gives us a sense of belonging and shared meaning. And also it doesn't, right? Why doesn't it? Because again, most people feel like they don't fit within these confines or these structures. So if you think about how those, like for example, how would that gender binary affect people who are new to the culture or whose worldview is different, right? Then they're going to be putting on those glasses and not necessarily understanding the lens that they're looking through or seeing everyone else in that same kind of context, right? So when it comes to these gendering examples, it's through associative memory or the way our brains process and transmit information that make connections so that some ideas are associated with other ideas in our mind. So examples of associative memory operating within the gender binary include feminizing housework and masculinizing yard work, right? This idea that women work inside the home, men work outside the home, so therefore women clean inside the home, men maintain outside the home. These are kind of normative constructions that have happened, in pretty recent modern constructions of masculinity and femininity. There's a perception that men are rational and women are emotional, right? Or that women are caregivers with compassion while men are breadwinners with strength, trying to associate dogs with masculinity and cats with femininity, right? These are just one of the many ways, one of the many gendering examples of how we kind of create this world for ourselves that we reinforce over time. So I'm sure you could think of other examples of ways that we gender things or traits or ideas. And this is something that, we're going to discuss more at length, and maybe we can actually review through the implicit association test. So stereotypes are another term for embedded associations. So stereotypes are fixed, oversimplified, and distorted ideas about categories of people. Since labeling and categorizing things are a huge part of socialization, stereotyping is as well. Even when we resist stereotypes, we've still learned them, right? So we have to break through them, but the primary socialization that we have oftentimes kind of clouds or is the lens that we look through to understand the rest of the world. So stereotypes are often based on facts that become generalized to apply to whole groups or get distorted or get oversimplified and become a stereotype. So our gender binary glasses allow us to view the world the way people around us do, but they can also distort our vision. Because ultimately, gender stereotypes fail to describe most of the people we know, including ourselves. So clearly there's issues here, and this makes sense why gender is such a topic that really kind of riles people up oftentimes, right? Because, it's kind of a foundational principle of our culture. And if so much of our understandings of everything else are built on top of gender, When you challenge those gender binaries, that challenges people's understandings in a lot of institutions, and that scares them, right? So if people get scared, they're not stoked about it. Though for us in education, that's a good starting point to learn some stuff. And hopefully that is what you just did through this lecture.